And new details are emerging about the deadly ambush of 4 U.S. soldiers in Niger. A Pentagon investigation reveals the men did not have clearance from commanders to go on the mission they were on when they died. Arise News' Andrew Schmertz has detail. Andrew?
Duarte, the head of U.S. Africa Command, General Thomas Waldhauser, testified before the House Services Committee today. He confirmed the 4 soldiers were not cleared to pursue the ISIS-linked militant. He declined revealing more facts until the families of the soldiers could be debriefed. Earlier, I spoke with Zachariah Mampilly about the U.S. militarization of Africa. He's the director of African Studies at Vassar College in upstate New York. The ramp up in Africa has certainly been tied to the war on terror. Highly criticized, President Obama was criticized with the use of drones. How has that changed the balance a little bit of what we're doing in Africa, and have we overstepped our bounds?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the big issues right now is that much of what has been happening on the continent has moved away from an emphasis on economic development or the promotion of democracy, and has been reduced primarily to the question of the war on terror. And as you point out, that began under Obama, but certainly expect that to continue under Trump. And I think a lot of what we've been seeing across Africa reflects this emphasis on militarizing the continent rather than trying to engage in trade or other types of political relationships we might have.
You know, it's interesting because it's actually China has been credited with stepping in and developing the economic relations, and the president and the United States has fallen behind because of that. But, you know, Africa has always been militarized, right? Individual countries have always relied and overpaid for their military to the detriment of their people. What is the perception? I know it's a big continent with many different views, but what is the perception of American military in many of these countries?
I think that one of the things that you have to pay attention to in the sort of competition between the U.S. and China is that China has coupled its increasing military footprint across the continent with a very broad economic development and trade program. So even as, you know, components of its military program are criticized, it is also accompanied by a lot of goodwill, especially at the governmental level, for the kinds of trade programs that China has engaged in. In contrast, you know, under Obama and certainly under Trump, much of the economic development programs have been cut back. Obama had a big initiative called Power Africa that was never actually led to much in terms of actually generating power for African countries which have a deep need in that area. And instead, primarily what we see across Africa is that the U.S. has retreated from any sort of genuine political engagement with African countries. The U.S. trade footprint has decreased, and we are left instead with primarily a military footprint across the continent.
It's interesting you bring up President Obama's initiative. Electricity remains very challenging across the continent. So 4 U.S. soldiers were recently killed in Niger. There are dangers to U.S. troops throughout Africa in many of these hotspots.
There was a report that was released that was the preliminary investigation of what caused the death of those 4 soldiers. And what is clear now is that those 4 soldiers were engaged in combat activities contrary to their actual mission of just simply being a training and advisory mission. So there's 2 levels to this. One is, you know, what are U.S. troops supposed to be doing on the continent, and what are troops actually doing? And clearly they are engaging in much riskier operations that even we as the public and even many in our political class are completely unaware of.
How much transparency is there for Americans? We sort of know military presence when we see soldiers, but I imagine there are many unmarked soldiers, if you will, and including the recruitment of individuals from those countries to work for the U.S. military. So the presence may actually be much bigger than we know.
Yes, I mean, I think the average American, and even I think academics who study these issues, vastly underestimate the scale of the U.S. presence across the continent. One of the striking things about the U.S. military presence in Africa is that it's primarily special forces who are spread out across the continent. So I've heard there are over 100 different special forces teams operating in Africa in this contemporary moment. So we may pay a lot of attention to news about a base being opened up in Niger or in Djibouti, but really the majority of the activities that the U.S. military is engaged in remain outside of the public record, and even are clandestine or covert to our politicians as well.
Are the U.S. military doing police enforcement in many of these countries?
Well, one of the possibly good things that the U.S. military does try to do is engage in professionalization of police and military forces. So there is a lot of training associated with the U.S. Africa Command, which is the primary body that engages with African militaries. that could be a positive thing. But like I said, much of the activities we're just unfamiliar with, and there's tension between the U.S. Africa Command and the Special Forces, who aren't in a direct sort of command and control relationship with each other.
How do we end up in these countries? Do the countries have to invite us in? I take it they do.
Yes, I mean, African governments are often very weak. They rely on U.S. military support to sustain themselves, and they do sign agreements. So we have, for example, an agreement with Niger that allows us to operate a drone base in that country.